Okay, we're going to move on now to Blandine Desanges, who is from France. Blandine is a French teacher teaching economy and sociology in high school. She's a radical feminist and activist, very attached to freedom of conscience and expression, which is another reason to speak here. Blandine is going to talk to us about how the counting of femicides is now under attack in France because it's seen as transphobic. So thank you so much for coming on. Bienvenue, and over to you, Blandine.
I am a feminist and a women's rights activist. This means that I am active in well-known associations and also in informal collectives, and that we allow ourselves all kinds of actions to advance the rights and the situation of women in France and around the world. As for the Women's Declaration International, I have been an activist there for more than 1 year, and I participate with other women in a podcast we created, which allows gender-critical women to testify on gender ideology, on their impact on their lives, and on the dangers of trans activism. If some of you are French-speaking, please subscribe to our podcast on social medias. We are the Rebelles du Genre, Gender Rebels. I am going to tell you about a recent event in France, which dates back about 2 weeks and which has greatly agitated the feminist sphere here. I hope this will be a peak trans moment for some people in France. In France, the development of the word, I will speak about the word, in French we say feminicide, and in English I think both are allowed. I will try to say femicide because I know it's the mostly used word. So in France, it has been progressively included on the political agenda by the feminist movement. In France, there is a feminist group of volunteers who, since year 2016, have been carrying out the very difficult task of identifying and counting femicide. This is a count of specific femicides, those committed by a partner or an ex-partner. At this stage, it is important to define what a femicide is. It is a murder of a woman because she is a woman. There can be murders of women who are not femicides when the reason is not because they were women. So these crimes will be called homicides. This is a particular crime, a crime of possession, the man considering that his partner belongs to him and gives himself the right to take her life when the woman leaves her partner. This is where a lot of femicides take place. The man is deprived of his object and decides to suppress it. This corresponds, from a feminist point of view, to highlighting the reality of male violence, which is certainly everywhere, but particularly important in France in the marital context. This also makes it possible to demonstrate that home is a place of danger for women, more than the streets and public spaces, which they try to make us believe are places of danger for women, and that for our good, it is better to stay at home. These are very useful statistics to support our request for changes in the law and in the means granted to institutions that take care of women victims of male violence. This collective is called Feminicide by Companion or Ex. Its goal is therefore perfectly clear. This work is done exclusively by women. The goal is to highlight the reality of domestic violence in France, the reality of male violence, and to show that sexism is dangerous, that sexism kills. In France, sexism kills about every 3 days. One woman is murdered by her partner or ex-partner every 3 days in France. The amount is between 110 and 115, and sometimes more, femicides every year. The collective has therefore given itself the dreadfully difficult task of collecting local press articles, of looking in the newspapers for all the events that could lead one to think that it was a femicide. This enormous work makes it possible to present to the general public the extent of male violence. It really made it possible to introduce the word femicide into everyday vocabulary. The collective makes the necessary researches, their names, their ages, what they liked, what they did for a living, if they had children. They describe the circumstances of the murder. It makes that these victims live in the memory of those who do not want to forget. There are descriptions, those of their murder by a man who confused love with possession. It also made it possible to change the media's treatment of femicides. The murders of women were before most often treated in the section of miscellaneous facts in the column passionate drama or under a title such as a dispute that ends badly. The collective regularly challenged the media who indulged in this kind of comment, and it really helped to move the lines. Counting conjugal femicides and talking about them therefore makes it possible to name male violence and to show it. It's important to emphasize that there is no follow-up by legal institutions, police, or justice of femicides by partner. Thanks to this collective, the French population, feminist associations have been able to communicate widely on male violence, and many demonstrations have taken place for about 4 years in France on this specific subject, and the word femicide has itself entered gradually in vocabulary and in the dictionary. We are fighting now for this crime to be specifically recognized in our legal text. This group regularly receives threats, but also pressure and harassment from activists hostile to the women's cause. From the outset, their work has been the subject of many critics, such as questioning of the term feminicides, requests to count men too, because they were also victims of women, requests to count women prostitutes, requests to count children because they are also victims of domestic violence, and it's true. Ask to remove from their count the elderly women killed by their husbands under the pretext of altruistic suicide. Like, for example, the counts of the newspaper Libération or the Agence France Presse, who then embark on a victim cleaning count and try to discredit them even with the government. Thanks to this work, another feminist movement was also launched in France by the activist Marguerite Stern, who created the street collage. Moreover, at the beginning, her movement was called Collage Féminicide, then evolved into Collage Feminist. She started alone, first in Marseille, then in Paris. Then other women joined her by tens, then by hundreds, and stick everywhere in France and even everywhere in the world slogans against femicides painted in black on white sheets, stuck on the wall, to the wall, and at night in the street. Unfortunately, this movement was itself quickly invaded by trans activists, who ended up expropriating Marguerite from her work in a very violent way, which is both a scandal and a great suffering for feminists, and of course, a great injustice for Marguerite. Subsequently, they deprived the action from their meaning by sticking slogans less and less understandable by the population, such as trans women are women, based on gender identity, bizarre pronouns, and threats against the so-called TERFs. Here, les TERFs au bûcher means TERFs on the pyre. So it's direct violence. The movement persists, however, through a new collective called l'Amazon and carries out street actions and in particular collages on violence against women, femicides in particular. L'Amazon has from the beginning adopted a charter declaring itself a radical feminist and describing why the movement is only for women and only by women, with women equal, adult, female, human. I am myself part of the Callers movement. I could largely develop the example as college as a strategy of dispossession and invisibilization of women led by trans activists. But that's not the point today. Let's go back to the collective that counts femicides. The collective Femicide by Companion or Ex, which has therefore done so much for the cause of women, for the fight against male violence and for the unification of the feminist movement in France, is now attacked for transphobia. How did that happen? First, there was a tweet from a presidential candidate, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, stating that when elected, he would enter the free gender declaration into the constitution. It's obviously a pure electoral promise, surfing on what he believes to be progressivism, well advised in this by people around him who are seduced by the trans activist movement. Of course, radical feminists immediately pointed out on social media how absurd and dangerous this proposal is for women's rights. If we cannot track male violence against women, sexism disappears along with women. We cannot longer think about male violence. We can no longer even describe our realities. It must be said that on January the 2nd, when there were already 3 femicides recorded in France for 2022, and today we mourn the 7th. Following this, a very harmful and very busy trans activist in France named Sacha Anxiety, a student, a son of Russian billionaires, questioned the fact that a very large feminist collective, Nous Toutes, continues to rely on numbers of this collective to talk about femicides. According to him, it is transphobia. Why? Because this account does not list murders of trans people. The goal is to make people believe that transphobia is a reality in our society and that trans people die and suffer even more than women. By dint of talking about transphobia, people will start to believe that it's a reality, unlike male violence, which will be masked. But in France, we have, and it's a good thing, no femicide of trans people. No more in France than elsewhere, there are people who run after trans people in the streets, shouting, "We're going to murder you." This account specialized in tracking femicide by partner or ex-partner. And in France, there has never been a single murder of trans people in a marital context, not a single one. And yet it would be necessary to count them for trans visibility and comply with the narrative of the trans activists. No doubt to extend the already delirious list of victims of transphobia that trans activists agitate in order to show how oppressed and victimized they are, even during our demonstration to fight for women's rights. In fact, over the past 15 years, there has been 20 trans people murdered in total, just over 1 per year. And unsurprisingly, it's almost always about people in a situation of prostitution, murdered by their clients or their pimps. We do indeed have trans people who are murdered, but they are in situation of prostitution. You should know that in France, we are very proud to be since 2016 an abolitionist country of prostitution. This means that prostitution is seen for what it is, misogynistic violence against women, contrary to human dignity, and must be fought. Pimps and clients are in France found guilty of this violence and are penalized. However, as you probably know, prostitution is prized by the trans activist milieu, which is therefore guilty of promoting a deadly and dangerous activity. They prefer to promote prostitution, which is the most violent, most dangerous, and above all, the most misogynistic environment. And meanwhile, men are killing women. The femicide by partner or ex account has nevertheless developed an argument explaining that there has never been, since the account existed, conjugal femicide of trans people, and that's why the account did not list any. That should have ended the debate. And yet no. Answer, yes, but these volunteers do not accept to include trans people. For good news measure, the trans activists claim that the collective does not count the femicide of racialized people, and this is obviously false. But it shows that they are ready to do anything to discredit the collective. Not only would these women be transphobic and putophobic, but they also would be racist. The collective Nutut then publishes a series of tweets denouncing the so-called transphobia of the collective and the alleged violence of the transphobic remarks made by the collective. They declare that it's both oppressive and illegal and decide to suspend the relay of the count of the collective. This decision is a real disaster for women's rights, not because Nutut carries out real actions that improve the condition of women, but because the development of Nutut was done by parasitizing the action of feminist associations and collectives, which Nutut largely exploited. They appropriated the work by communicating widely about them without citing them, for example, to the point of becoming almost synonymous with feminism in France for the general public. In the media, we can hear about Nutut demonstration or Nutut count of feminicides, when they only use what other women did elsewhere. You should know that, for example, at the time of the controversy, the Facebook page of the femicide by companion or ex collective has around 20,000 subscribers, while Nutut has around 200,000. From the start of the work of this collective, Nutut appropriated their work and used it widely, without quoting its source. Nutut grew up in the artificial light of the media, while the collective femicide by companion or ex worked in the shadow. The invisibilization of the collective is truly problematic on an ethical level, obviously, but also because it deprives the collective femicide by companion of the subscriber that they should have had because of their simple work, which is extremely widely distributed. The decision of Nutut to stop relaying this count, in reality to stop pretending that they were doing the job, deprives a very large part of the French population of an access to information on femicides. It should be noted, however, that since this event, the femicide by companion collective has gained subscribers, about 15,000, and Nutut has lost some. The decision of Nutut, therefore, very concretely silences the voices of the victims of feminicides. Nutut is okay to make invisible, even to suppress the work of this group of women volunteers to promote the trans activist cause. This is cancel culture. And it doesn't stop here. Family Planning, one of the oldest and largest feminist associations in France, and which is now largely colonized by the trans activist movement, publishes a tweet declaring its solidarity with Nutut. No feminism without the fight against transphobia. No transphobia in feminism. And in this tweet, Family Planning recalls its support for trans people who are victims of violence. Not a single word about women. The collective femicide by companion or ex then reaffirms its position. Our angle of work is the domestic violence. This is the choice we have made, and no one has the right to impose another one to us. And for your information, in 6 years, no trans woman or man has been killed by a partner. The Universalist Feminist Association, Oser le Féminisme, supports the collective, its approach and its anger. French women, politicians too, but a very few of them. In France, it's particularly violent and disturbing in a context where freedom of conscience is guaranteed by a constitution and by our history. We are a non-religious country. We got rid of the clergy and their dictates. We should be protected against dogmas and religions. And yet, transactivism is becoming the official religion. Whenever women express themselves for what concerns them directly, act for themselves, organize themselves to defend their rights, transactivists consider it as transphobia, harassing women until they succeed in erasing them. This is exactly what is happening in France today. The French feminist movement seems to be deeply divided. In reality, it's not a question of division, but of entrism, of parasitism. We are suffering from a huge, deadly patriarchal backlash. On the one hand, there are feminist associations that are still resisting, whether or not they display anti-queer positions. Some are silent, for they fear reprisals or are under threats. And on the other hand, there are long-term feminists who did not see the danger coming, seduced by liberal feminism, or parasitized by young activists who have emptied the words of their content, and who are completely masculinist today because they are victims of transactivist entrism like Nous Toutes or like family planning. The great battle remains to be fought.